And we're live. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with you all. Welcome to Stripe Office Hours. And my name is Cecil Phillip. I'm a developer advocate at Stripe. And what we do here is pretty much get folks from around the community that are building tools and extensions and just fun things, either involving Stripe or related to Stripe. And we have them come on and just have a really nice, cool conversation with us. And today, I have two friends of mine that are here. I'm really excited to have them on. We have Danny and Deep from Fern, and they're going to be talking to us about some of the tools that they're building to make API development and developer experience and SDKs and documentation and all of those types of things so much easier for developers. So why don't we start off with Danny really quick. Why don't you introduce yourself for folks? Tell folks about who you are and what do you do?
Hey, my name is Danny. Folks that are live, welcome. I'm one of the co-founders here at Fern. We're based in Brooklyn, New York. And before I started this company a couple of years ago with Deep, I actually was at Amazon and AWS. And one of the things that I got to take away from my time at AWS was that they offer SDKs in a wide number of programming languages to make onboarding to AWS easier. And Amazon built a whole internal tool and staffs a team to generate SDKs and API reference documentation. And at one point was talking to Deep and was like, someone should productize this and I'll let Deep take it from there.
Hey, yep. As Danny was saying, I met him at University of Michigan. And so my name's Deep Singhvi, also one of the co-founders here at Fern. And so I spent 4 years after college working at Palantir. They built a lot of different microservices. And over there, they actually built something very similar to what we are building at Fern. So at Palantir, when you would go build an API, you would actually write the API definition in a YAML format, and then you would run a command called conjure generate. And that would generate all sorts of code from the server to the SDKs, as well as documentation. When Danny and I were talking, we saw that the same tool was actually built at Amazon, and that's when we realized, hey, there's an opportunity here. Maybe we can rebuild some version of this tool and give it to all the companies that haven't built it themselves just yet.
Yeah, that sounds amazing, man. Thank you folks so much. And
I think, Cecil, there's something that just came out there, which is for all the entrepreneurs listening, when you see a repeated pattern of companies having to build internal tooling to solve a problem, I think the key is, can you pattern match and find if lots of companies are building SDK generator toolings, there's probably a company that could exist to serve thousands of companies.
And that's true, right? And it's all about finding the opportunity, right? And it sounds like you two found a great opportunity. And I think Fern is, I want to say 3 going on 4 years now. Am I close to it?
3 years exactly. And we're open source. So I think the first commit was in April of 2023.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. So we definitely want to get more into the story of like Fern, and I love a good origin story. So we're going to make sure we get into that too. But I also want to acknowledge our community. So folks, why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves? Go ahead in the chat and let us know, what countries are you all watching from? Have you used Fern? Have you tried it before? Let us know. And if you have any questions as well, go ahead and drop your questions in the chat. And as the conversation goes on, definitely make sure that we will, make sure those get answered for you. Now, what I'm going to do really quick before we get started is I'm just going to bring my screen up, and I want to share just a few Stripe community highlights. Being a developer company, we have tons of folks in the community just doing a lot of amazing stuff. But I always want to make sure we acknowledge our community because, this is who we do it for, right? Now, a friend of mine over at Apollo GraphQL, they build tooling around GraphQL for developers. They actually did a really fun video just a couple of weeks ago about API orchestration with Stripe checkout. So I definitely recommend you guys go ahead and check this one out. And then over on YouTube, our friends at Temporal builds like workflows as a service type things, but they're also open source. You can run them locally if you wanted to. They have a really fun demo here as well that they use the Stripe API, I think along with OpenAI and some other tools to build like a travel service AI agent. Again, never really thought about that one, but that one was really fun. So this is also a pretty interesting video for you to check out. So make sure you do that as well. And then the other highlight I want to show y'all really quickly. one of our open source developers, DJ Stripe. So DJ Stripe is a Django extension for Stripe. So if folks are building applications with Python and you use Django, you want to integrate payments inside of your application, then they just released a new version just 3 weeks ago, as it says right here on GitHub. So definitely wanted to highlight that super quick and make sure you guys go and check that out as well. And last highlight I'm going to pull up here real quick before we dive back over and start digging into Fern. Over on stripe.dev, and stripe.dev is, our developer blog that we have to, talk about different things, including Stripe. One of our engineers internally, Singhvi, he actually wrote this blog post that talks about adding LLMs to, your payment workflows. But not only that, he introduced this Stripe agent toolkit, which again is a fun way for you to, if you're building Python apps or TypeScript apps and you're building stuff with AI, it's a really fun way for you to be able to integrate Stripe inside of your agent workflows. So what I'm going to do is I'll make sure I share these links inside of the chat so folks will have them, and they'll also be in the recording as well. I see some folks in the chat are asking, is this going to be recorded? It will be. It'll be recorded and available on YouTube and LinkedIn as well. So depending on wherever you're watching it, you'll still be able to come back and refer to this a little bit later. Now, that being said, I'm going to pull my screen off. And there we go. I'm going to pull my screen off. Now, what I want to ask you for my first question is, how did you come up with the name Fern? And what does Fern have to do with APIs? Tell me tell me about that origin story.
So yeah, I can walk through that a bit. So we kind of had figured out, this was maybe 2.5 years ago. We were all living in Seattle, and we had pivoted through a couple of startup ideas, and we had figured out, hey, we want to do something with APIs, and our tool is going to be a CLI. And at the time, the company was actually called Birch. So we knew we wanted to be something plant related. And so at that point, the requirement became, hey, it has to be plant related. It has to be really short because people are going to be writing this CLI command in their terminals. And we need to have a GitHub organization that is actually open. And so putting all those three requirements together, that's kind of how we came up with Fern. I just spent basically 4 or 5 hours going through an encyclopedia of all the plants. And then Fern was the first one we found that met our criteria.
It's kind of optimizing for developer experience, even in day zero, of knowing that people are going to be typing this a lot before their commands.
That's fantastic. I love that. I love that. So we talked about, you guys thinking about how folks are building APIs. If I was someone that's watching this video and I'm what exactly does Fern do? What would you say? What are the tools? What are the things exactly that you offer for developers that make their lives easier?
I would say that let's start with the outcome, which is that businesses subscribe to Fern's products and buy our products to make API integrations easier. It's about developers onboarding. When a developer decides they want to start using an API, they have to do a lot of integration work. And it's hard to integrate in a couple hours or in an afternoon. I mean, in the early days of Twilio and Auth0 and Stripe, the differentiator was ease of use and low friction to onboard. And so at Fern, we are developer experience tooling. And specifically, we will generate SDKs so that a developer can get an idiomatic client library in their language of choice. And we will build and host an API documentation website so that you can understand what are the operations of an API and how do I use it.
One of the things that I always say particularly for folks that are in the business of making APIs is your SDKs and your documentation, that's your first impression. You know what I mean? It's we just met each other and I'm coming to shake your hand. That is my first impression of you. And those impressions make a difference, right? And
do you remember when we were looking at auth solutions? We were evaluating Auth0 and Stitch and WorkOS, and why we decided on one of them?
Yep. So at that point, I was very focused on Java, and my first thing was hey, how do I hit the auth APIs using Java? And so when we looked at Auth0, they had some great Java SDKs out there. Stitch was a bit newer; they had a fancier UI, but they didn't have that Java SDK. And so I didn't feel like writing all this HTTP boilerplate. And so for me, it was a split-second decision of, great, they offer the Java SDK, let's pick them as the vendor. So you're totally right. Like first impressions matter. And for a developer, it takes maybe even seconds to come to a conclusion on the company based on SDKs and docs.
For sure. But I also have to think about it from the other side, right? Like if I'm the company, if I'm a developer, we know developers don't like writing documentation. Just as much as developers don't like doing testing. Like there's certain things that we don't like to do as much. We'll do it, but we don't like to do it as much. And so I often find sometimes documentation ends up being one of the last things that gets created because you don't want to generate it too early because you know there's some churn and there's going to be some change. But then also too, like when you're ready to ship, you don't want to delay shipping because now I have to create these artifacts before I put up my product out. So I always find like sometimes automated solutions like Fern really help one get my developers like inside of my company going a lot faster in terms of like letting folks know how our API works, what are the endpoints, what are operations I can call, but also to like, let you do what you're good at, right? Like you're the documentation guys, my guys can focus on coding, and now we can both be like productive together.
One of the trends that we've seen there is folks going from server code into an open API specification and then into docs and SDKs. And by far the most popular framework to do that is Fast API in the Python world. You get this beautiful pipeline that of just go write server code, generate an open API spec, and automatically feed that into a tool like Fern, and you get docs and SDKs without having to do additional steps that developers don't enjoy.
One thing I remember too is how do you deal with companies that come to you and say, sure, automation will make my life a little bit easier, but the quality might not be exactly what I want it to be. Maybe my developers could write something by hand that'll take longer, but it'll be more performant, it'll be more customizable. And I'm sure you guys have heard some of these types of things. When someone comes to you as a customer and they have these types of concerns, like what is your answer to that? Deep, I'll point over to you. Maybe you could grab that question.
Yep. So just to clarify there, you were saying the question is companies come to us and they ask us, hey, we're not going to be able to tailor this to exactly what we need if we use a third-party solution. Does that capture the question?
Right. Essentially, we as the company feel like we can have more performant, more customizable API SDKs if I write it myself, right? So What would you say to that? How can you, say, okay, we can still do that for you, and you can still get great performance, and you can get great customizable SDK generators?
That's a great question. Yeah. So I'd say the way that we approach this is actually through our sales process. And so typically when a company comes to us, they'll book like a 30-minute demo. And in that demo, what we do is we collect all the requirements that they want to see in an SDK. So it's like, pretend you're a voice AI company and you're going from text to speech or speech to text. We'll collect all the different requirements of what is the custom logic that you want. How fast do you want these SDKs to go and perform the relevant operations? And then when we come back a week later and we show them a demo, we show them the SDK with all of those bells and whistles and all of those features so that there isn't really an opportunity to say, hey, this is not as customizable as what I wanted. This doesn't have all the things that I would have been able to add. We kind of just collect those requirements up front and then show how the product is actually customizable.
Yeah. I think naming some of those requirements would be helpful. Deep, are you up to name 5 requirements that might come through from a customer?
Yeah, so a good example is caching. So like let's say you're sending a bunch of events in your API, but you want to make sure that it's really fast. Can I add caching to the API? And that's something where if someone mentions that in the demo, we'll make sure to add it. Another example is WebSockets. Another example is custom logging. Another example is OAuth with different types of flavors. And for the last one, you could say schema validation, making sure that the objects that they're sending over the wire actually match the schema. And so our goal is to collect those requirements. And, we're a startup. So in most cases at this point, we have so many customers that the product is truly extensible. But every now and then we'll get a customer that gives us a new 6th requirement or 7th requirement that we don't support. And we'll use that to actually go make the product better and build it into the product before showing them, hey, this is what Fern can do for you.
Gotcha. Now, I really think it's time for us to get into a demo. But before that, I'm going to bring up a question real quick that came up from some folks in the audience. This question is coming in from Adam on YouTube, and pretty much he's asking, I've always wondered why SDK gen and documentation tools are so expensive. So it's tough for a new company or solo developer to build an API first product when these tools have such a prohibitive cost. But I guess I would also say that Fern is open source. So, what do you folks have to say about that?
Yeah. Well, one, Adam, I feel you. I much prefer when things are either free or low cost, especially when Deep and I were getting started. It was just the two of us. Our approach right now is that we're focusing on the customer segments that have a willingness to pay, whether it's $10,000 or $100,000 or $500,000 a year. That's where we are spending our time and doing a really great job building out the product. Our opinion is that we will come back later and introduce the lower priced or the free tier. It's just a matter of strategy. So, Adam, I totally feel the pain. It is not what you will see from Fern in the coming months, though.
Nice. And then we have another question. This one's coming in from LinkedIn. What are the biggest challenges in automating API documentation while ensuring accuracy and developer usability? So that sounds kind of similar to the question I asked before, right? About folks being concerned about some of these things being generated.
Yeah, by far the biggest challenge is around customization. And Cecil, you mentioned a demo. I think if you're up for it, now would be a good time to demo. And some key to your question of customization, we're going to walk through that in the next 15 minutes together and look at how you can customize, because it's not actually about rendering the API reference. It's about making the docs website experience feel coherent with the rest of your brand and company style.
Awesome. So Deep, I think what I'll do then is I'll switch over to your screen, and maybe you can give us a demo of some of Fern's tools and show us how we could generate documentation and SDKs using it.
That sounds great.
All right, great. All right, so your screen
there's nothing like a live demo,
Nothing like a live demo.
And when Deep and I were prepping for this, we were like, well, what API or docs website should we build? And we figured, well, if you're on the Stripe podcast, the only thing that's appropriate to do, dev hours, right, with Stripe. But the only thing that's appropriate would be to do the Stripe docs and see if we can build it in 30 minutes.
Oh, no way. Well, now I got to see this. You got my attention.
Awesome. So let me actually pull up the Stripe docs. So if I pull up Stripe docs here, I can actually go see the Stripe docs. And so our goal today is going to be to build some version of this website that you see here, except using Fern. And so, like Danny said, we're going to be showing off
the size of your screen a little bit so the font's a little easier to see.
Yeah, for sure.
Perfect.
How about now?
Yeah, there you go. That looks good.
Awesome. So our goal is going to be to build this version of the Stripe Docs website and also show you an API reference that talks through all the different endpoints and objects that the Stripe API supports. So maybe let's get started there. The first thing that we're going to need in order to actually generate this Stripe documentation website is going to be an OpenAPI spec. So I'm going to go back to Google. I'm going to search for Stripe OpenAPI. I'm going to pull up the Stripe OpenAPI GitHub repo here and just kind of see if I can find an OpenAPI spec. Looks like Stripe has a bunch of different OpenAPI specs here. And so I'm going to click into one right here, spec3.sdk.yaml, because our goal is going to be to build a doc site as well as generate an SDK.
And I'm guessing you all support JSON as well as YAML for the API spec.
That's right. We support JSON and YAML. So we can use JSON as well. It's pretty, it's crazy that Stripe's API is 8 megabytes. GitHub can't even render it in its local view here. So we'll just view the raw JSON.
Well, I think that's a good test because this is not a small API, right? This is not a create, read, update, delete on one resource, right? You're talking about tons of resources and a lot of operations.
Megabyte YAML file. Like, I don't even know, but it's a lot of characters.
That is a lot. That is a lot.
So what I'll do is I'll actually copy the link right here. I'll go back into my IDE. I'm using Cursor, which we can get into more. But I'll kick off with a simple command here, Fern init. And I'll pass in a link to the OpenAPI spec. I'll zoom in just so you can see that a little bit better. And you can see here, I'm just running the command Fern init -- OpenAPI.
And Deep, just so I understand, how did you get Fern installed on your machine?
Great question. I ran npm install -g Fern API. Boom. That installed Fern on my machine. I can run that command again, Fern init OpenAPI, pass the link to my OpenAPI spec, hit enter. And then, I'm going to be emulating Stripe. So I'm going to pick my organization name here today to be Stripe. And there we go. So this in my IDE has now instantiated a folder. There's a couple different files that have been created, but most importantly, I have my OpenAPI file. It's 7 megabytes long. We can just get our accurate line count here. So we have 189,000 lines of API definition. And then I also have a file called generators.yaml and overrides.yaml, which I'll get into briefly. Now, before I move any further, I'm actually going to go and run a command called fern check. What fern check will do is it will make sure that my API spec is valid. And if my API spec is valid, that means that Fern will be able to generate docs and SDKs. So we can see here, Fern found a couple warnings, but no errors. So we're not blocked on actually creating a doc site.
So when you say that there's no errors, you mean like you've just validated the schema, right? Like the schema is clean. There's no issues with it. There's no missing properties or anything of the sort. Like you have
That's
what you
exactly
need
right.
to generate the stuff.
Yep. So just as an example, we can come back into our OpenAPI. We can actually just create an error somewhere. So if I go into the request body for a specific object here, like maybe this one, where this account get endpoint returns an account schema, maybe I can just add some gibberish here next to the account keyword. So I just made it account 1234. And now if I run the command fern check, I expect to see some sort of error telling me, hey, I can't find account 1234. So there we go. We see that error. I'm going to revert back just to make sure my schema is valid. Run fern check again. Make sure everything is good.
That's what we said when we picked the company name. People are going to be typing Fern a lot. Look at it already.
Right? Hey, I can see that.
Great. So, now the error's gone away. Things are valid. The next thing that I'll do here is I'm actually going to run fern init -- docs so that I can create a simple docs configuration now that I've loaded in my API. Awesome. So I created a simple docs configuration. I'm actually going to make my docs pretty bare bone to start. And I'm going to set up a hot dev server so that we can see and iterate on these docs together and make them look pixel perfect.
And I'm guessing as you're creating the docs, are they Markdown based documentation?
Yes, this will be Markdown based documentation.
Okay.
So kind of while the server is spinning up, it's loading here on localhost 3000. There's no content on here, so we can come back. I'm just going to pull up the Stripe docs website again, and maybe we can analyze this website so that we can figure out what we have to do in Fern. So first couple things that I see here are Stripe has a logo up here. There's several tabs in the actual documentation. Each tab has its own content. And then there's this interesting pixelated pattern on the landing page of the docs. So this gives me a little bit of an idea of, hey, I really want to create some tabs. I want to maybe grab the logo. I want to grab the pixelated design. And then I want to add some markdown content in each of these tabs. So that's what I'm going to do for my first step here.
So And while you do that, I just wanted to say, when you first said API docs, in my mind, I was thinking, okay, I'm thinking reference documentation. The reference documentation that here's the endpoints, here's the sample request response, here's the payload, right? But now, are you talking about actual, documentation that
Yeah. So this was one of the things that we were
product
wrong about
descriptions?
when we started building Fern. So we thought that people need API reference docs that document the SDKs. So we started building that for one of our customers.
Okay.
And then they were like, but now I need to add a landing page. And we're like, no, we're just an API reference builder. And they're like, no, you're not. We need a landing page. This is how you have to listen to customers. So all of a sudden they had a landing page, and then they were like, we want to just write like 1 or 2 pages about how to authenticate and get an API credential.
Sure.
And we also have rate limiting. And it got to the point where it's like, okay, they need to add an arbitrary number of sections with pages, and they want to write markdown for those pages. So we support both .md and .mdx file formats.
What's interesting about this is because as I think about companies that I've worked with and been a part of, the folks that are building the API and the folks that are generating the documentation are usually not the same people, right? And so you have your engineers that I could very easily see running Fern to generate like just the reference documentation, or we put it in our CI/CD pipelines. But I can also see like your documentation team, your docs writers, your content creators, and folks inside of your company actually creating these pages and creating these designs and putting them up on some static site somewhere based on the stuff that you're doing in Markdown. So it's like I almost feel like Fern is not only for developers, right? Like it's your docs writers, it is for your developers, it's for your ops folks that are doing CI/CD that are generating and publishing stuff. I kind of see it now plugging into a bunch of different things, like as you're showing me this demo.
Well, even today, I mean, we have 200 plus Slack channels with customers or prospects, and that's the main way we interact with our customers. And even today, someone said, we're using Zendesk for our help center content, but we'd prefer to use Fern. And they asked, like, how do I do that?
Okay.
And the answer should be absolutely. I mean, as an entrepreneur, the answer is like, absolutely. Tell me more about give me more requirements.
Yeah. But it's always great that when you have a product, open source or not, when you can get feedback from your community, right? I think that's one of the best things about building software. Because if you build it and no one knows you built it and no one's talking about it, then I think we have a problem, right?
Yep. So now the Fern Docs product supports API reference for REST APIs and webhooks and WebSockets. It supports pages like guides or tutorials, and it supports change logs. Nice. And that's one of the things that I was also surprised about. People wanted a change log with an RSS feed. And the answer is absolutely. That makes sense.
So does that change log like plug into GitHub commits and GitHub releases, or is that manual instead?
Right now it's manual, but we've been working on, can we basically use an LLM here to go from what changed in your open API spec? Imagine taking a diff and then summarizing those changes.
That's fantastic. Okay.
The minute we started doing that, Cecil, the next question we got is, can you do this for each of my SDKs? I want a change log for each SDK, and if Fern's generating the SDK, they should know how it's changing, that's rational too.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Totally makes sense.
I don't think any developer loves writing a Python change log between patch versions.
Like we mentioned earlier in the stream, right? Like if you could do the things that I prefer not to do, and we could just automate that away, that's an easy sell.
So I'll give a little bit of voiceover to what's going on here on the screen. So if you've been seeing while Cecil and I have been chatting, Deep, the first thing that he did is in this docs.yaml file. This is where you configure things like the navigation and the layout. And so Deep said, I want some tabs. So if we go up to, I think it's line 13 where there's tabs, he's specifying that give me a get started and give me a payments and give me a finance automation. And all of these were the tabs that we were seeing on the actual Stripe Docs website.
That's right. And so now if I go back to the, rendered output here, you can see all those individual tabs. You can see the styling start to take effect. I'm going to come in here and I'm actually just going to go ahead and paste a much more descriptive landing page here. So let me grab that.
And you can see that this is an MDX file. And so in this case, the landing page supports both Markdown as well as JSX so that you can use components.
Nice.
And we've got a built-in component library with things you'd expect, like code blocks and cards and accordions.
Exactly. So this is an example of me using 3 cards here, creating a simple, looks a little messy right now, but we're going to tweak this. And now here I have 3 cards with a couple different links. I'm going to grab some more styling here.
And one of the things that we learned is that companies really care about the styling of their docs. And so one of the features that we needed to support was custom CSS. So people want to being able to override decisions we've made, whether it's the roundness of a button or the shadow of a component.
Sure.
So we just grabbed these CSS files actually from the Stripe docs itself. And now we're going to come in and tell Fern about all of these different CSS files in docs.yaml.
As you were showing that hot reloaded preview, you said, this looks a little messy, but I was just thinking, you've probably been doing this for 5 minutes and you already have a page up with links and tabs and all kinds of stuff. So, I mean, again, thinking about time to productivity, right? Like as we think about like how long does this take developers to do? I personally don't think I would have had that page up in 5 minutes if I hand wrote it myself. Just say.
Oh, Deep, you got that background.
We got that background. So
did that come through the CSS?
Exactly. It came through the CSS. It also came through an image that we embedded directly into the landing page Markdown.
Nice.
Right here.
Sweet. Okay, so we've now got a basic landing page, and we've got, it looks like a page under each of the tabs. Do we have an API reference?
Yep, so let's add that next. So let's add a tab for API reference.
I also encourage folks who are live on the live stream to drop in questions as you have them. We'll do our best to answer them.
Yeah, we'll definitely make sure we do that. We don't have any new questions yet, but yeah, definitely as they come in, we'll make sure we ask them. While Deep is doing that, so when I think about Open API, right, and us generating like these documentations, that's almost like I've built the SDK, I've generated this Open API thing, and now you're generating documentation based on that. But I know some folks like to do a spec first API design. You know what I mean? So like I design the spec before I build the thing, right? Does Fern have anything of that sort? Like, do you have your own language definition that I could use to like specify endpoints and a designer, an API designer, so to speak, in your product? Or are you purely give us the reference and it will generate the stuff for you?
Great question. When we started Fern, we took inspiration again from AWS, a tool called Smithy, and Palantir, a tool called Conjure, both of which are open source. Both of them decided not to use Open API because it kind of sucks.
Okay.
So when we started Fern, we were like, we should introduce our own definition to describe a REST API. We wrote a YAML format and we call it the Fern definition. Okay. Heavily inspired by those 2 other existing tools.
Yeah.
And it turns out that convincing people to use a new standard is an uphill battle. And so there's a common Microsoft expression of embrace, extend, and extinguish. Cecil, are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Yeah, so we went basically with extinguish.
Okay.
On day 1. And it just turns out that that's not a good idea. It's just hard to go into a company and get adoption, because what happens is you meet someone like a head of engineering or a VP of developer experience at Stripe or a company like Auth0 or a company like Twilio, and they're like, we already have this Open API spec. We don't want to, we want to take what we have and we want to get a Python SDK.
Yeah.
Or we want a docs website. And so one of the lessons for us is we started with the extinguish, and that's just silly. Instead, right now, we're very much in the embrace. So we do support the Fern definition format, which about 25% of our customers use, but the majority actually start with Open API if they've got REST or webhooks, and they'll use async API if they have web sockets, and then we actually even also support gRPC.
Oh,
If
do you?
buff files. Yeah, one of our customers, Pinecone, a vector database company, starts with gRPC.
Really? I did
And
not.
so one of our lessons was we need to support already widely used industry standard specs.
That makes sense. That totally makes sense. So one of the projects I'm involved with is called the Dapper project, and Dapper is built on open standards, right? Because kind of like what you said, if this is the standard, why build another thing? So I think that totally makes sense.
It looks like we have a doc site, and this looks hosted on what domain is that, Deep? Do you mind making your font a little bigger?
Yeah, I can make that a little bigger so you can see here.
Cool.
Did you just publish that?
Yes,
Yeah.
I just ran Fern generate -- docs, and that took that local setup that I was showing you, and it published it to the cloud. And now we have a doc site that is accessible here on this URL.
Oh my goodness, you guys just stole our documentation. That's crazy.
And now if I click into this API reference tab, you'll see that there are all these different resources that have been created. I can click into, each resource. I can see the query parameters that are accepted, the response that people get back. The response also is nested, so I can see like nested objects. I can do this across all the different resources that Stripe has.
That's cool, but Deep, what about dark mode?
Great question. Here,
nice.
So my CSS still needs a little bit of work, a little bit of help, but now I'm in this mode where I can test, I can show this website to folks, and I can get both the dark mode and the light mode.
That's awesome. Okay, now I know. So you're generating this yourself. So like this isn't the part that you took the CSS from the site from. Like this is your stuff. So in addition to having like these different links and operation IDs and things of that nature, can I interact with the endpoints through here? Is that possible or no?
Yeah, great question.
I can.
If I zoom here, you'll see that there's this play button. It's actually a little hidden, and we're working right now on a release to make this play button more front and center. But the moment I hit play here, this will actually pop up a drawer from the bottom of the docs, largely inspired by the Stripe shell in the Stripe docs. Nice. Once this drawer pops up, I can see those same endpoints here on the left, but now instead of a static read-only view of the API, I actually get an API reference where I can see and make requests to the underlying Stripe API itself.
Nice. I like that.
So for example, I can, put in a dummy token really quickly, hit send request, and boom, now I'm getting a response from Stripe servers telling me, get your real API key.
Nice. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen this part of the product before, but this is pretty cool. So like in the documentation, I don't have to go anywhere. I could just get my keys, my tokens. I could be, I don't have to change context. Right?
Exactly. And as you hover over each of the different properties that are available to you in the playground itself, you'll see that there are doc strings from the Open API that are showing up on the right here.
Nice. One of the things that's interesting to me, and maybe I should have said this a little bit earlier, but one of the reasons that I wanted you all to come up here is because we have a lot of folks on Stripe that are building API first products, right? And, I know someone in the chat was asking, well, what about pricing? And, I know they're asking, like, what does Fern cost? I know that's what their question is. But now I'm thinking, hey, if I'm a business and I'm selling API as a service, right, to my customers, I'm probably going to want a pricing page. I'm probably going to want a link to click a button and, do the whole thing and then get my keys and all that types of stuff. And I'm just thinking, based on what you've shown me, I should be able to scaffold a pretty fundamental version of that using MDX files and some of the other stuff you've showed me here. So it's almost like, I feel like we can get pretty close to generating the company sites with just Fern, because I can have my front page that has, all of the verbiage and the marketing material, and this is what the API does and descriptions. I can have a pricing page that obviously we can create inside of MDX, but then I can also have my reference documentation. So after folks sign up, I get my API key and I can just do everything right here in the same place.
And Cecil, one of the things we don't do today is API key management, where we can, someone generates an API. Right now, that's on our customers. But we're definitely scratching our head to figure out how can we be more and more helpful to these API first companies.
Sure. And speaking about API companies really quick. So someone in the chat just asked, maybe I missed this, but how does Fern handle OAuth? Now you mentioned you guys don't generate API keys, but what about some of these other standards again, like OAuth and OpenID Connect and things of that nature?
Great question. So we handle OAuth in a couple different ways. I'll pull up an example customer just to answer this question. So I'll pull up a company called Chariot. They actually
I love Chariot. All right, they're really cool. Their whole pitch is that it's easy to take credit cards online like Stripe. Deep, you got me excited. They're a YC company. Their whole pitch is that there's a lot of donor advised funds, which is when a donor says like, hey, I have like $10,000, let's say, that I plan to give to charity this year, and I want to use my donor advised fund. And Chariot makes it easy to add a button on like the Red Cross website where you can donate via your fund. And they like specialize not in credit card or bank account, but in donor advised fund. Continue, Deep.
Yeah, so this is
business.
So this is that donor advised funds that Danny was just talking about. This is the entire documentation website for Chariot, all the way from their guides to the API reference to a changelog. All of this is markdown files through Fern. And one of the things here is that they actually use OAuth for their authentication. So the first thing I'll show is I'll actually just pop open the playground, and I'll show you how we handle OAuth here on this endpoint. And so you can see here, when a user is entering their OAuth in the playground, Fern will allow the user to enter the client ID, the client secret, or provide the bearer token directly. And if the user enters their OAuth 2 credentials, we will be smart enough to go fetch the token and then use the fetch token when making the underlying API request. So again, we're just removing friction for the user by removing one more additional call to the API and just automating it for them.
Nice.
The second thing I'll call out is that if you look at this code snippet on the right here, this is a code snippet not of fetch requests, but of the Chariot SDK. And Chariot uses Fern to generate their SDK. And you can see here that a user of the Chariot SDK just needs to provide their client ID and their client secret. And Fern handles using that information to fetch the token and consistently refresh it. And so both across SDKs and across docs, that's how we handle OAuth 2.
Got it. Nice.
Well, Deep, it's cool that Chariot's got the SDK code in their docs, but what about Stripe?
Yeah, great question. So right now, if we look at Stripe's drop down here, these are all going to be HTTP snippets. And what we're missing is we haven't actually generated the SDK. So while we have a couple minutes still left on the podcast, I've set up this Stripe demo GitHub account, GitHub org here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a repository for the Stripe Node SDK, and we'll create a demo Node.js SDK for the Stripe API. I've created my repository over here. I'm going to go back into my editor where I had my open API spec as well as my docs. And one other file that I have next to the docs.yaml file is this file called generators.yaml. Now in generators.yaml, what I can do is I can actually configure my generators as well as where they output code to. So in our case, we actually don't want to output code to the file system. We want to actually maybe put it on NPM. I won't actually enter my token, so this is not going to hit NPM, but this kind of shows you what the configuration would look like. I can put in a GitHub location, so I can actually drop in a GitHub repository for the one that I just set up. And this is pretty much all we need to now start generating an SDK for the Stripe API. So I'm going to come in here. I'm going to run Fern generate. So I'm going to run Fern generate, specify the TypeScript SDK. Maybe we'll do a version that is an alpha. And then we're off to the races here.
Nice, nice.
So Deep, can you explain a little bit about what's going on of like, how does the open API spec turn into TypeScript files?
Yep, so you can see the log lines here. What we're doing is we're actually going over every single path in the open API spec, and we're converting it into an internal representation that Fern only knows about. And so we're iterating over all the query parameters, iterating over all the path parameters, the request body, the response body, all the errors, and we're feeding that into the generator. So once we iterate over all this information, the generator will go endpoint by endpoint, and it will basically generate really large strings and write them as files. So code generation, it may feel like very complex, but at the end of the day, all you're really doing is you're building up strings, you're writing them into files, you're committing them, and you're running git push. And that's exactly what our generators are doing here.
Nice. Now, there's a question really quick that popped up on YouTube. I want to answer this question super quick. So Matt Davis is asking, what does Fern have to do with Stripe? So, and I know this came up, and this is going to probably come up in some of the other streams that we do. So Fern is a customer of ours. Definitely appreciate your business. But Fern is also a very API first, developer first company, and Stripe also, we consider ourselves very much developer first. And being who we are at Stripe, being who we are in terms of like the space that we occupy for developers, we only do one thing, right? Like we handle payments, so we move money around your application, right? But that's not your whole application, right? Like your app does other things, right? You're probably going to need a database. You're probably going to need some UI stuff. Maybe you have a mobile app. Some of the things you're going to need is probably security, probably going to need docs, probably going to need SDKs, right? And so what we're trying to do here on office hours and in this stream in particular, we're just trying to show you some of the other puzzle pieces that you could put together to make your entire application. So again, imagine that you're an API company and you have to generate SDKs and you have to generate documentation and all the other things, right? But you're also a Stripe customer. We're not going to do that for you, right? You still need the puzzle pieces, right? So Fern is a great option for you to do that. So this is why we have them on. This is why we're talking to them today. So definitely appreciate your question. But, I think one of the things that you're going to see us do here on this channel going forward and some of these other ones that we do is, we're going to talk about Stripe stuff, but we're also going to be talking about like, what are the other pieces that you need for an application or for your business? Because again, we can only do so much because we're focused on the financial aspect of it. But folks like Fern are going to be focused on the SDKs, the documentation, and some of that developer experience. So hopefully that answers your question, Matt. Really appreciate it. Just had to answer that real quick because I know a couple of folks are probably thinking the same thing. Now, I know we're running low on time. There's one question in particular I wanted to ask the both of you folks. Now, I'm looking on your documentation page. Actually, I'm going to switch my screen real quick. I'm looking at your documentation page, right? And I can see you support TypeScript, Python, Go, .NET, Java, Ruby, right? And coincidentally, I'm PHP. I'm sorry, PHP folks. I love you too.
I was like, this Laravel going to come after you.
I know, man. I don't want any problems, man. And I'm looking at some of these things. I'm looking at the bottom. You have Rust, you have Swift, you have Terraform coming soon as well. Stripe, we don't support all of these SDKs, right? And so looking at the demo that Deep just showed us, whenever Swift comes out, whenever Rust comes out, whenever the Terraform stuff, well, maybe not Terraform, but at least whenever the Swift and the Rust stuff come out, and they're like, oh man, Stripe doesn't have an SDK for my language, you can definitely jump onto Fern and they could generate that stuff for you using our SDKs, right? So I think that's another great benefit of, again, talking about some of these types of tools and trying to find solutions where, again, we can't do everything for you, right? So maybe we can look at some of these companies like Fern to help us, find solutions for those types of issues. All right, so I'm gonna go back over to your screen real quick, Deep. I'm sorry, I feel like I cut you off a little bit.
Not at
So
all.
this demo looks pretty good. I know we have a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to really quick circle around and ask you, after folks see this, like after folks have watched this video and watching it live, sharing it with your coworkers and all that great stuff, like what do you want them to know about Fern? Like what do you want them to do? What do you want them to try out? Like what should be their next steps?
Yeah. First, it's if you are building a public-facing API and you need docs or you need a TypeScript, Python, SDK, or other language, come talk to us. Second, if you are looking for a new role, even if you haven't been on the hunt very long or you're just thinking about it, if you want to work on an open source developer tool, we're based in Brooklyn. We all work in person. We're a very engineering focused organization. I'll share our jobs link, but we're currently hiring for backend, front end, and what we call deployed engineer, which is kind of one of the superpowers of Fern, very much inspired by the Palantir deployed model, where Cecil, I'll give one example, which is that Square didn't like the way they were maintaining their SDKs in the past. They switched over to Fern. And so we actually have an engineer working with them on about every 2 weeks, we're releasing a new SDK, a new major version across all of their suite of SDKs. And I think there are a lot of companies like Square out there that would prefer an automation tool rather than handwriting their SDKs or building docs in-house.
Nice. Deep, you have anything you wanted to add to that really quick?
No, I think the two key words, and I'll pull up our landing page for this, is I would encourage people to just go to buildwithfern.com. This describes both products that we offer, docs and SDKs. And there's also a showcase that folks can look at and see like, hey, how are companies today using Fern and what does it look like? And so if you want to just get a quick primer, this website's a great way to do that.
That's awesome. I feel like I should have added this, but this is my like one last thing moment that I gotta have really quick. Is Fern doing anything with LLMs and documentation today?
We are. Deep, if you don't mind pulling up one of our customers, maybe the 11 Labs team. So 11 Labs is a company that uses Fern for SDKs and docs. And one of the benefits of that is that within the search experience of their docs, you can get an AI-assisted chat with docs. And so we call this
No, you cannot. Are you serious?
You can. And so this was originally actually built by Stripe. So a lot of what we're doing is inspired. Stripe is like very much pioneering. But one of the benefits is you can ask about their SDKs, their API, or just their general documentation. And we are indexing on all of it. And under the hood here, we're for the nerdy folks at home that want to know, we are using Algolia to store records. We are using Turbo Puffer. I'll say it one more time because it's a fun name, Turbo Puffer, as a vector database. And then we are using AWS Bedrock, specifically Claude's Sonnet 3.5, to create these responses.
Nice. And so is this a service is this something that you're just like prototyping this with the folks at 11 Labs, or is this something that's available to all of your customers today?
No, this is available to the Fern customer base.
That's fantastic.
Our goal is to just incrementally like keep adding value to our customers.
Awesome. Well, Danny, definitely. Thank you all so much. This is a really great demo. For folks, again, if you're interested, definitely make sure you head over to Build with Fern. I'm going to pull up the link again real quick at the bottom. So there's a link at the bottom of the screen, buildwithfern.com. And then also, if you're interested in checking out what they're doing on GitHub, there's also github.com/fern-api. If, again, maybe you want to ask for a feature or commit.
Contributors.
Right. If you want to contribute some features or share an opinion, upload some issues or anything of the sort, you have the opportunity to do that there as well.
Cecil, my last comment on my end is that from day one, we got into the startup program at Stripe, and we were able to accept payments from our early customers that were paying something like $50 a month at the very early days.
Yeah.
And never once have we had to think about our payments infrastructure. Have we had to think about invoicing? We use the subscriptions product. We automate sales tax. And the amount of administrative overhead that has been eliminated through specifically the Stripe for Startups program was really helpful to us in the early days.
That's fantastic. And it makes me feel good to know that like we can help you be productive. And then hopefully for the folks that are watching, they can look at both of us, right? They're like, oh, great, I could use Stripe and Fern and whatever my development stack is, and I could be productive and build APIs that people love. So definitely appreciate that.
Deep, thank you very much for the live demo today.
Thank you so much, Deep.
Thanks so much, Cecil, for letting us do this.
Sure. Now, really quick, folks, before we leave, I'm going to switch back over to my screen. Deep, I'm going to take your screen off. And let's just run through a few quick announcements before we hit the road. So this first link I'm showing you, Danny mentioned this a little while ago, but like Fern is hiring. And someone in the chat just asked if Fern is looking for AI engineers. Well, it looks like they are in New York because it says it right there on the page right there. So if you're interested, I can go ahead and drop this link in the chat. So folks, if you're interested in working for Fern, you can definitely do that. Speaking of Stripe, on May 6th through 8th, so that's in a couple months from now, we're having Stripe Sessions. Stripe Sessions are our big company conference. We do it every May. We have developers there. We have, folks from the community there. We have, tons of companies and people that are just interested in the world of payments and payment APIs and payment technologies. So if you're interested, definitely feel free to come over and hang out, register for Stripe Sessions. One thing I want to announce, I'm going to scroll down here a little bit. So we always have some really interesting folks that are coming down to keynote speak. So here's some of the speakers that we have. I think just a couple of days ago, we announced Mark Zuckerberg's going to be one of our speakers there. He's going to be at Stripe Sessions, answering your questions and, things of that nature. So again, if you wanted to know who are some of the folks that are going to be there in person at Sessions, there you go. So again, Stripe Sessions, that is May 6th through 8th, is going to be in San Francisco, California. So if folks are in the area, come by, or if not, feel free to fly over. We do not pay for your plane ticket, so please don't take that as don't feel like that's what I'm saying. But definitely feel free to come over and hang out and check it out. And the last couple of things I want to mention to you folks. So we are doing Stripe developer meetups. We started that late last year. It's been going pretty well, and so we're just going to keep the ball rolling. So actually, next week, some of us are flying into New York. I didn't know the Fern folks are in New York, so surprise, we're going to be in your neck of the woods. We're going to be in New York. We come over here to events. We are having a meetup on, this is February 13th, right? So just before Valentine's Day. So we're going to be in New York. We have a little meetup thing that's going on here for that. And then also we are going to be in Dublin as well. So we're going to be in New York. We're not going to be in Dublin next week. We're going to be in New York and in London on the on March 11th. So there you go, folks. So just letting you know about a few things that we got going on. But with that being said, thank you all so much. We will be back. We're going to be doing these on Wednesdays. So definitely stay tuned to the Stripe channel. And also, if you're watching us on LinkedIn, stay tuned here as well. We're going to be doing some more of these. But thank you so much, and we'll see you all later. Bye.